When people imagine Napoleon Bonaparte, they picture a conqueror standing over maps of Europe, armies moving at his command. But that image hides a truth that is far more important. Napoleon began his life as an outsider in every sense of the word. He was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, a land that had only recently become French. The island was poor, violent, and deeply divided. Vendettas were common. Loyalty was personal, not political. Napoleon grew up hearing stories of resistance against France, even as his family slowly aligned themselves with French rule out of necessity rather than belief. From the beginning, Napoleon did not belong. His family was minor nobility, noble enough to claim status, too poor to truly live it. This fragile position shaped him early. He learned to observe, to calculate, to endure humiliation without forgetting it. As a child, he was withdrawn, intense, and quick to anger. He read obsessively, not for pleasure, but for escape. History, mathematics, and stories of ancient heroes filled his mind. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to attend military school. The experience was brutal. He spoke French with a heavy Corsican accent. His classmates mocked his name, his speech, his manners. He had little money, wore worn uniforms, and spent most of his time alone. While others formed friendships, Napoleon isolated himself. While others played, he studied. Teachers noted his talent for mathematics and artillery, but also his stubbornness and lack of charm. One instructor described him as reserved, obstinate, and excessively ambitious. Ambition, however, was not yet power. When Napoleon graduated and became a junior artillery officer, France itself was on the brink of collapse. The monarchy was weakening, the economy was failing, and resentment simmered everywhere. Napoleon watched this carefully. He read political pamphlets, followed debates, and absorbed the language of revolution long before it exploded. Then, in 1789, everything broke open. The French Revolution did not arrive as a single event. It came as confusion, riots, rumors, fear. Authority collapsed almost overnight. Nobles fled. Officers deserted. Entire regiments dissolved. For a young officer like Napoleon, this chaos was terrifying and full of opportunity. The old system that had mocked and excluded him was falling apart. At first, Napoleon's position was precarious. His Corsican background made him suspect. His political opinions were unclear. He supported revolutionary ideals, but not blindly. What mattered most to him was order-control structure emerging from chaos. He returned briefly to Corsica, hoping to play a role in its future. That failed. Local politics turned against him. Former allies became enemies. His family was forced to flee the island under threat of violence. Napoleon was 24, homeless in a country tearing itself apart. By in France, the revolution had entered a darker phase. The monarchy was gone. The king was executed, and fear ruled Paris. Accusations became death sentences. Loyalty was questioned constantly. Even silence could be interpreted as treason. This period would later be called the Reign of Terror. Napoleon survived it by doing what he had always done. Staying useful, he focused on artillery and efficiency, positioning, and calculation. He avoided public speeches and emotional displays, while others shouted revolutionary slogans. Napoleon studied logistics and battlefield geometry. He understood something critical. Revolutions destroy, but armies decide who inherits the ruins. His moment came in 1793, at a place called Toulon. The city had rebelled against the revolutionary government and invited foreign powers to occupy its harbor. For France, losing Toulon meant losing control of the Mediterranean. The situation was desperate. Napoleon was assigned almost by chance. He immediately saw what others had missed. The problem was not the city, it was the harbor. Control the artillery positions overlooking the bay, and the enemy fleet would be forced to withdraw. It was a simple idea, ignored because it required precision, speed, and risk. Napoleon insisted. When the plan was finally approved, it worked exactly as he predicted. The enemy withdrew. Toulon failed. France noticed. Almost overnight, Napoleon was promoted, but promotion during the revolution was dangerous. The same government that elevated you today could execute you tomorrow. Napoleon was aware of this. He learned to navigate politics with caution, never fully aligning himself with any faction. Then the political ground shifted again. Robespierre fell. The terror ended, and with it, many careers, including Napoleon's protection. He was briefly arrested, questioned, and released. His association with fallen revolutionaries made him suspect. He was placed on inactive duty. No command, no influence. Once again, he was close to being forgotten. It was during this period that Napoleon experienced what he later described as his most dangerous enemy, insignificance. He wandered Paris, nearly broke, watching others rise through connections and charm. He wrote letters asking for commands. Most went unanswered. Then came October 1795. Paris was on the brink of another uprising. Royalists threatened the revolutionary government. Thousands marched toward the city center. The politicians panicked. They needed someone who could act without hesitation. Someone suggested Napoleon. He was given authority over the city's defenses. Napoleon did not negotiate. He did not hesitate. He positioned artillery at key streets and intersections. When the mob advanced, he ordered grape shot fired into the crowd. The uprising collapsed within hours. It was brutal, effective, unforgettable. That single decision using artillery against civilians, the government unsealed Napoleon's reputation as a man who would do what others would not. Some condemned him. Others quietly took note. Soon after, he was rewarded with command of the Army of Italy. Too many, it looked like a promotion. In reality, it was a test. The army was starving, demoralized, and expected to fail. Success would be miraculous. Failure would be convenient. Napoleon accepted without hesitation. As he prepared to leave Paris, few believed he would return as anything more than another forgotten general. He carried no illusions, only plans. The boy from Corsica, mocked and isolated, was about to step onto the stage of history, and Europe was about to learn his name. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte took command of the Army of Italy in 1796, the French Revolution had already begun to rot from the inside. The streets of Paris were quieter now, but the silence was deceptive. The guillotines had slowed, yet fear lingered everywhere. The men who had survived the terror were not the most virtuous or idealistic, but the most adaptable. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. Power shifted constantly, and loyalty was provisional. Napoleon understood this better than most. He had watched revolutionary heroes rise and vanish almost overnight. He had seen generals executed not for failure, but for being politically inconvenient. The lesson was clear. Victory alone was not enough. One had to control the narrative around that victory. As Napoleon traveled south to join his army, he carried little with him, no entourage, no reputation worthy of awe. What awaited him was a force that barely resembled an army at all. Soldiers were unpaid, unfed, and deeply cynical. Desertion was common. Officers argued openly. Discipline existed mostly in theory. When Napoleon arrived at headquarters, the reaction was muted. Some officers barely acknowledged him. Others openly doubted him. To them, he was a political appointment, a young general sent to command a forgotten front so Paris could be rid of him. Napoleon did not confront them. Instead, he listened. He read reports late into the night. He questioned supply officers. He learned which units could still fight and which were close to collapse. He memorized terrain, distances, and enemy positions. He rarely raised his voice. When he spoke, it was precise and final. Slowly, the tone began to change. Napoleon issued his first proclamation to the army shortly after arriving. It was blunt. You are hungry and naked. The government owes you much and can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power. It was not poetry. It was a promise. What Napoleon offered was movement. He knew stagnation killed morale faster than defeat. Waiting for supplies that might never come was a slow death. Advancing taken initiative gave his men something to believe in. The enemy, meanwhile, was confident. The Austrian and Piedmontese forces, believed the French army of Italy was incapable of coordinated action. Their commanders expected slow, predictable maneuvers. They planned to wait, consolidate, and crush the French when the opportunity arose. Napoleon intended to deny them time. He reorganized the army with ruthless efficiency. Weak commanders were sidelined. Artillery was concentrated rather than scattered. Orders were simplified. Speed became doctrine. Where traditional armies moved cautiously, Napoleon pushed relentlessly. The campaign began almost immediately. What followed shocked both sides. Napoleon did not seek a single decisive battle. Instead, he struck at the seams where enemy units met, where communication was slow, where terrain limited movement. He forced his enemies to react instead of plan. Each victory created confusion that fed the next. Soldiers who had once doubted him began to change. They noticed that Napoleon remembered names, that he rode among them, that he placed artillery where it mattered most. He shared their risks, if not always their suffering. He demanded everything, buddy. He also delivered results. Victories came quickly. Wheat, H1, Napoleon's confidence grew and so did his reputation. Reports sent back to Paris transformed small engagements into heroic triumphs. Losses were minimized, successes were magnified. Napoleon was careful with words, understanding that perception traveled faster than truth. The government in Paris began to pay attention. But attention was dangerous. The Directory, the ruling body of France, was deeply unstable. Corruption was widespread. Fear of both royalists and radicals haunted every decision. Napoleon's growing popularity made politicians uneasy. A successful general with loyal troops had ended republics before. Napoleon sensed this tension. Rather than confront it directly, he distanced himself physically. He stayed in Italy. He kept winning. Sent money, art, and prestige back to France, making himself useful but hard to control. Behind the scenes, he cultivated relationships carefully. He married Josephine de Beauharnais, a woman well connected in political circles. It was not a romantic match. At first it was strategic. Josephine gave him access to Parisian society. Napoleon gave her security. Together, they became visible. As victories piled up, something subtle shifted within Napoleon himself. The young officer who once feared obscurity now feared only limitation. He began to speak less of serving France and more of reshaping it. The language of duty slowly gave way to the language of destiny. Still, he remained cautious. He watched how quickly public opinion turned on former heroes. He saw how generals who lost a single battle were discarded. He learned that the revolution rewarded success but punished weakness mercilessly. Napoleon would not be weak. By the end of the Italian campaign, he was no longer just a general. He was a symbol order of victory, of possibility in a nation exhausted by chaos. Soldiers adored him. Civilians feared and admired him. Politicians argued over how to use him or how to stop him. And Napoleon himself was already thinking beyond Italy. The revolution had destroyed the old world. Something new would replace it. The only question was who would control what came next. Napoleon believed he already knew the answer. By late 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer an experiment. He was a problem one Europe could not ignore. The Italian campaign had transformed him. The hesitant, overlooked officer had become a commander whose presence alone altered the course of battle. His army moved with purpose now, not desperation. They trusted him, and that trust was dangerous for his enemies, and for France itself. Napoleon understood momentum better than any of his contemporaries. He believed that war was not won by isolated victories, but by breaking the enemy's ability to think clearly. Speed, confusion, and pressure were his true weapons. The Austrian commanders still failed to grasp this. They continued to fight according to traditional rules: slow advances, careful positioning, rigid command structures. Napoleon exploited every weakness. He attacked where they expected defense. He defended where they expected retreat. Most importantly, he forced them to fight on his terms. One of the clearest examples came at Arcole. The battlefield was a nightmare marshland. Narrow causeways, fog thick enough to swallow entire regiments, Austrian forces held strong defensive positions. Any frontal assault would be costly and possibly disastrous. Napoleon attacked anyway. When French troops hesitated under heavy fire, Napoleon seized a flag and moved forward himself, stepping onto the bridge amid chaos and smoke. Soldiers followed, inspired not by orders, but by presence. Though the assault initially failed, the psychological effect was immense. Napoleon was no longer just issuing commands. He was becoming myth. Word of his actions spread faster than official reports. Soldiers exaggerated stories. Civilians repeated rumors. By the time accounts reached Paris, Napoleon had already grown larger than reality. He encouraged this, quietly. He understood that belief could be as powerful as artillery, but belief had a cost. As his confidence grew, so did his impatience. Napoleon tolerated incompetence, less and less. Officers who failed him were dismissed without hesitation. Those who succeeded were rewarded but always kept at arm's length. Trust to Napoleon was conditional. Victory followed victory. At Rivoli, he demonstrated his greatest strength, anticipation. He predicted enemy movements before they happened, positioning forces where they would be needed hours later. When the Austrians attacked, they found French troops already waiting. The battle was decisive. With Rivoli, Austria's position in Italy collapsed. Entire regions fell under French control. Napoleon negotiated directly with defeated states, often without consulting Paris. Treaties were signed in his name. Resources flowed through his hands. For the first time, Napoleon was acting not just as a general but as a ruler. This alarmed the French government. The Directory depended on Napoleon's victories, but they feared his independence. He commanded loyal troops, controlled wealth, and enjoyed public admiration. Worse still, he seemed increasingly uninterested in obeying instructions that conflicted with his goals. Napoleon noticed the tension. Instead of confronting it, he leaned into success. He sent vast amounts of money and artwork back to France, presenting himself as the revolution's greatest asset. At the same time, he kept his army close, loyal, and dependent on him personally. His soldiers were paid on time, something rare in revolutionary France. Promotions were based on merit rather than politics. Napoleon made sure his men understood one thing clearly. Their fortunes rose with his. Behind closed doors, he began to think differently. The revolution, he believed, had failed to create stability. It had destroyed the old order, but replaced it with weakness and fear. France needed structure, authority, direction, and perhaps someone strong enough to provide it. Yet Napoleon was not reckless. He knew timing mattered. He knew that appearing too ambitious too soon could be fatal. He studied the political landscape as carefully as any battlefield. Opportunity, he believed, always revealed itself. By 1797, Austria sued for peace. Napoleon dictated terms that reshaped Europe. France emerged victorious beyond expectation. The Italian campaign ended not with exhaustion but with triumph. Napoleon returned north as a hero, but even as celebrations erupted, he felt restless. Italy had proven his genius. It had given him legitimacy. But it was no longer enough. He needed a new stage. A greater challenge. Something that would place him beyond the reach of politicians. Beyond comparison with other generals. As he studied maps once more, his eyes drifted eastward. Thouward. Egi. P. In early 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte returned to Paris as the most successful general France had produced in a generation and found himself with nothing to do. There were no parades worthy of his victories. No permanent command that matched his stature. Instead, there were polite receptions, quiet smiles, and careful distance. The Directory praised him publicly while ensuring he remained politically isolated. They feared what he represented. A man adored by soldiers, respected by enemies, and increasingly convinced of his own necessity. Napoleon felt the shift immediately. In Italy, he had been decisive. In Paris, he was constrained. Committees debated endlessly. Decisions stalled. Corruption was obvious and tolerated. Men with no vision ruled by fear of one another. Napoleon attended meetings where nothing was resolved and left frustrated, his energy wasting away in rooms heavy with caution. This was not what he had fought for. Privately, he began to worry not about enemies, but about history, he believed, did not wait for anyone. A general without an army was a man already fading. He had seen it happen to others. He would not allow it to happen to him. The Directory, meanwhile, was searching for a solution of its own. France was still at war with Britain, an enemy impossible to defeat directly. An invasion across the Channel was unrealistic. The Navy was weak. The economy, fragile. What the government needed was a distraction, something bold, far away, and risky. Napoleon became the answer. The proposal was ambitious. An expedition to Egypt. Officially, the goal was to threaten British trade routes and expand French influence. Unofficially, it solved multiple problems at once. It removed Napoleon from Paris. It placed him far from politics. And if he failed, distance would soften the consequences. Napoleon saw through this immediately. Yet he accepted. Egypt offered something Italy never could: scale, mystery. The chance to present himself not just as a general, but as a world historical figureon, Alexander reborn in the modern age. It was dangerous, uncertain, and far from Europe. That made it perfect. Preparations began in secrecy. Troops were gathered, ships assembled, scientists, engineers, and scholars were included alongside soldiers. An unusual decision that revealed Napoleon's broader vision. He did not intend merely to conquer. He intended to reshape. In May 1798, the fleet sailed. The Mediterranean was unforgiving. Heat crushed the men below deck. Water ran low. Disease spread quickly. Napoleon kept strict discipline, but he also kept morale alive with promises of glory and discovery. When they landed in Egypt, reality struck hard. The land was vast, ancient, and indifferent. The heat was unbearable. The enemy Mamluk cavalry was fast, fearless, and unfamiliar with European tactics. The French were exhausted before they ever reached Cairo. Napoleon adapted. At the Battle of the Pyramids, he arranged his troops into defensive squares, using artillery to shatter cavalry charges. It was a decisive victory, and Napoleon ensured the symbolism was clear. He addressed his soldiers and pointed toward the ancient monuments behind them. "From the heights of these pyramids," he said, 40 centuries look down upon you." The line was remembered, repeated, immortalized. But beneath the spectacle, trouble brewed. Shortly after, the French fleet was destroyed by the British Navy at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon was effectively trapped in Egypt, cut off from France, cut off from reinforcements, cut off from reliable information. The Directory, intentionally or not, had succeeded in isolating him. In Egypt, Napoleon ruled like a governor. He restructured administration, imposed order, and attempted to win local support. But resistance simmered constantly. Revolts erupted, supplies dwindled, the environment wore down even the most disciplined soldiers. For the first time, Napoleon's control felt fragile. He pushed forward regardless into Syria, toward impossible objectives. Siege after siege drained his army. Disease spread. Morale cracked. At Acre, Napoleon faced his first true, undeniable failure. The city Denis' army bled. He was forced to retreat. The myth wavered, and then news arrived from Europe. France was in crisis. The Directory was weaker than ever. Enemies closed in. Political chaos returned. The very men who had sent Napoleon away now needed him. Napoleon understood the moment instantly. Leaving his army behind under trusted command, he slipped away from Egypt in secret and sailed back to France. It was an enormous risk. If captured, his career would end. If discredited, his legend would collapse. But fortune favored boldness. When Napoleon landed in France in October 1799, he was not treated as a deserter. He was welcomed as a savior. The government was desperate. The people were exhausted, and Napoleon was exactly what the revolution had produced but could no longer control. He had been forgotten. Now, he was necessary, and in Paris, the stage was finally set for something far more dangerous than war. When Napoleon Bonaparte returned to Paris in late 1799, France barely resembled the nation he had left. The revolution was spent. Its ideals had been diluted by years of bloodshed, corruption, and compromise. The Directory still ruled in name, but not in strength. Laws were ignored, finances were in ruins, and confidence in government had evaporated. People no longer argued about liberty or equality, they wanted stability. Napoleon understood this immediately. He did not storm into politics. He did not denounce the government publicly. Instead, he listened. He observed the weariness in every conversation, the frustration behind polite words. France was not looking for another revolutionary. It was looking for relief. Behind closed doors, politicians argued endlessly about solutions. One faction blamed royalists, another blamed radicals, a third blamed foreign powers. None of them trusted one another. Every decision felt temporary, reversible, weak. Napoleon positioned himself carefully among them. He presented himself not as a tyrant, but as a soldier above politics, loyal only to France. He spoke of order, efficiency, and national survival. He avoided ideology and focused on results. It was exactly what frightened men wanted to hear. Soon, quiet meetings began. Key political figures, most notably Emmanuel Size, believed the Republic needed restructuring. The Constitution, they argued, was flawed. Power was too fragmented. Government, too fragile. They needed a strong executive to save the revolution from itself. What they needed, in other words, was a sword. Napoleon agreed to help, but on his terms. Plans were made for a legal transfer of power. The language was careful. This would not be a coup, they insisted. It would be a correction, a necessary step to preserve the Republic. Napoleon knew better. On November 9th, 1799 to 18 Brumaire, and the revolutionary Calendarita plan was set in motion. Troops loyal to Napoleon were positioned throughout Paris, under the pretext of protecting the legislature from an alleged uprising. The government complied, too weak to resist its own protector. The following day, events unraveled. Napoleon entered the legislative chambers, expecting authority. Instead, he faced chaos. Lawmakers shouted accusations. Some called him a dictator. Others demanded his arrest. For a brief moment, the situation teetered on collapse. Napoleon hesitated. It was the closest he would come to failure. Then his brother Lucien, presiding over one of the councils, intervened. He declared that armed extremists were threatening the government and appealed directly to the soldiers outside. The troops obeyed Napoleon. The chambers were cleared by force. By nightfall, the Directory was finished. France woke up to a new government, the Consulate. 3 consuls would rule, but everyone understood the reality. Napoleon was first consul. He controlled the army, the administration, and most importantly, the future. Yet he moved cautiously. There were no executions, no mass arrests, no public terror. Napoleon had learned from the revolution's mistakes. Violence created enemies. Stability created acceptance. He focused immediately on reform. The economy was stabilized. Tax collection was reorganized. Corruption was punished selectively enough to inspire confidence, not enough to provoke backlash. The Catholic Church was reconciled with the state, ending years of religious division. Education was centralized. Law was standardized. France began to function again. The public responded with relief. Napoleon worked tirelessly. He slept little, demanded constant reports, and involved himself in every major decision. He believed control required presence. Ministers came and went. Institutions bent to his will. The machinery of states slowly reshaped itself around one man. But Napoleon was not satisfied with being first consul. Power, once tasted, sharpened ambition. He began to speak of permanence of protecting France from future chaos. The Republic, he argued, needed continuity. Leadership must not change with every political wind. Stability required authority that could endure. The idea was dangerous, but France was tired, and tired nations accept arguments they once would have rejected. Napoleon allowed the conversation to grow organically. Newspapers praised his leadership. Public votes confirmed his authority by overwhelming margins. Each step appeared legal. Each change seemed reasonable. By the time people realized how much power he held, it felt irreversible. Napoleon had not seized France in a single blow. He had reshaped it, piece by piece. And as Europe watched uneasily, one truth became impossible to ignore. The general forged by revolution had become something else entirely. A ruler in all but name, and soon, even the name would change. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte secured his position as first consul, Europe was already preparing for war again. The old monarchies had learned a painful lesson during the Revolutionary Wars. France was no longer predictable. Its armies did not fight like others. They moved faster, lived off the land, and were led by officers promoted for ability rather than birth. And at the center of this transformation stood Napoleon, a man who treated war not as ritual, but as calculation. Napoleon knew peace would not last. Britain remained defiant. Austria watched carefully. Prussia hesitated. Russia loomed in the east. France, though exhausted, was stronger than it had been in years, but its survival depended on momentum. Napoleon believed that hesitation was more dangerous than risk. He reorganized the army immediately. Traditional European warfare emphasized rigid formations, slow advances, and carefully planned supply lines. Napoleon rejected much of this. He broke his forces into independent corps, self-sufficient units, capable of marching separately and fighting together. This allowed his armies to spread out, move rapidly, and concentrate suddenly at decisive points. To his enemies, it felt as if French forces appeared everywhere at once. Napoleon personally involved himself in planning. He memorized terrain, distances, and roads. He knew how far a man could march in a day, how long artillery took to reposition, how morale shifted under pressure. War, to him, was a science guided by intuition. In 1800, Austria challenged French control in Italy once more. Napoleon responded with audacity. Instead of marching directly toward the enemy, he led his army across the Alps through routes considered impassable. Snow choked the passes. Cannons were dragged by hand, using ropes and hollowed tree trunks. Soldiers slipped, froze, and collapsed. But they crossed. When Napoleon emerged behind Austrian lines, the enemy was stunned. The Battle of Marengo followed, a fight Napoleon nearly lost. Early mistakes and overconfidence put his army in danger. 4 hours, defeat seemed inevitable. But when reinforcements arrived late in the day, Napoleon seized the moment, counterattacking with brutal precision. The Austrians broke. Marengo cemented Napoleon's reputation not just as a daring commander, but as one who could recover from the edge of disaster. To his supporters, it proved genius. To his enemies, it proved something worse. Resilience. Peace followed for a time. Napoleon used it to strengthen France internally. Roads, bridges, schools, and laws were standardized. The Napoleonic Code reshaped legal systems across Europe, emphasizing equality before the law and property rights. Even his critics admitted its brilliance. But peace, Napoleon believed, was temporary by nature. In 1803, war with Britain resumed. Soon, a new coalition formed against France. Austria, Russia, and others prepared to crush the French Empire before it grew too powerful. Napoleon moved first. In 1805, he executed one of the greatest strategic deceptions in military history. While Europe believed he planned to invade Britain, Napoleon suddenly redirected his army eastward with astonishing speed. Entire corps marched hundreds of miles in weeks, converging on enemy forces before they fully realized what was happening. The result was Olem. An entire Austrian army was surrounded and forced to surrender without a major battle. Europe was shocked. Traditional warfare had failed completely. Armies that moved slowly and relied on rigid plans could not survive against Napoleon's system. Then came Austerlitz. Often called Napoleon's greatest victory, it was a masterpiece of manipulation. He deliberately weakened part of his line, inviting the enemy to attack. When they committed fully, Napoleon struck the center, splitting their army in two. Fog lifted, sunlight broke through the clouds. The sun of Austerlitz, Napoleon would later call it. The coalition collapsed. Austria sued for peace. The Holy Roman Empire of 1,000 years old ceased to exist. Europe was reshaped, not by diplomacy, but by movement and timing. Napoleon's soldiers believed in him absolutely. They believed he was unbeatable. That belief carried them through exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Napoleon cultivated it carefully. He rewarded loyalty, promoted talent, and ensured his presence was felt everywhere. He was visible, decisive, and relentless. But speed had consequences. Napoleon demanded constant motion. Armies marched year-round. Campaigns blurred together. Men aged quickly under the strain, and as victories multiplied, so did Napoleon's confidence. Perhaps too much. He began to believe that his system could overcome any obstacle, that speed could solve every problem. That belief, so powerful in war, would soon be tested by something no army could outmarch: distance, winter, and time itself. By 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer simply winning wars. He was reshaping how Europe understood power. France now stood at the center of the continent, not just militarily, but psychologically. Kings ruled by tradition. Napoleon ruled by momentum. His enemies feared not only his armies, but the speed at which their plans became irrelevant. Campaigns that once took months were decided in weeks, sometimes days. And behind it all stood one man. Napoleon understood something crucial. Authority did not rest on force alone. It rested on belief. Soldiers had to believe in him. Citizens had to believe in him. Even enemies had to believe in him, if only enough to hesitate. So he cultivated belief deliberately. Bulletins from the front were carefully written. Victories were emphasized. Mistakes were softened or blamed on circumstance. Napoleon appeared to omnipresent, leading charges, directing artillery, sparing cities, rewarding courage. Paintings portrayed him calm amid chaos, hand tucked inside his coat, gaze fixed on destiny. It was not accidental. Napoleon controlled the message as tightly as he controlled his armies. Newspapers praised him. Plays celebrated him. Schools taught his victories as national triumphs. To criticize him openly was not illegal, but it was dangerous to one's future. Among the army, devotion reached near religious intensity. Soldiers spoke of Napoleon as if he were fate itself. They believed he saw everything, anticipated everything, protected them through genius alone. Many veterans would later say that simply knowing Napoleon was nearby made them fight harder. Napoleon encouraged this subtly. He appeared at unexpected moments. He remembered names. He awarded medals personally. He spoke to soldiers not as subjects, but as comrades. And yet, he remained distant enough to seem larger than life. At the same time, he demanded absolute obedience. Failure was tolerated only if it came from boldness. Hesitation was unforgivable. Generals who questioned him too openly were removed. Others learned quickly. Success meant alignment with Napoleon's vision. Europe watched with growing unease. Prussia, long confident in its military tradition, believed itself immune to French innovation. Its army was disciplined, drilled, and proud. Its generals trusted outdated doctrines and dismissed Napoleon as reckless. In 1806, Napoleon shattered that illusion. At Jena and Auerstedt, Prussian forces were crushed in a matter of hours. The defeats were not merely military, they were psychological. An army that had not lost a major battle in generations collapsed almost instantly. Napoleon entered Berlin as a conqueror. He walked through the city deliberately, aware of symbolism. He visited the tomb of Frederick the Great, a man he both admired and sought to surpass. To some, it was an act of respect. To others, a message. The old order was finished. With Prussia defeated, Napoleon's control over Europe expanded dramatically. He reorganized territories, placed relatives on thrones, and dismantled ancient political structures. Kingdoms became administrative units. Borders shifted at his discretion. Napoleon believed he was creating stability, but beneath the surface, resentment grew. Occupations bred resistance. New laws clashed with old customs. Local elites were humiliated. While some regions welcomed reform, others saw only foreign domination. Napoleon dismissed these tensions as temporary. He believed that time and success would smooth everything. The continental system, his attempt to economically strangle Britain by cutting off trade, was imposed across Europe. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it hurt allies as much as enemies. Smuggling flourished. Economies suffered. Loyalty weakened. Still, Napoleon pushed forward. His confidence had become absolute. He no longer saw limits, only obstacles to be overcome through will and speed. When advisors warned him of overextension, he ignored them. When allies hesitated, he pressured them. When enemies resisted, he crushed them. Victory had taught him one dangerous lesson: that he was always right. And yet, cracks were forming. Spain erupted in rebellion. Guerrilla warfare bled French forces slowly, relentlessly. There were no decisive battles to win, only endless ambushes, assassinations, and resistance. Napoleon, master of open field warfare, struggled to adapt. For the first time, belief wavered, not everywhere but enough. Napoleon remained powerful, feared, and brilliant, but the cult surrounding him had begun to demand constant success, and constant success, history teaches us, is impossible. Still, Napoleon did not slow down. He believed the answer to resistance was not restraint but greater force. And so, he turned his attention eastward once more, toward an empire vast enough to test even his belief. Toward Russia. By 1811, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. From the Atlantic coast to the borders of Russia, Europe bent willingly or not. His will. Kings ruled because he allowed it. Laws existed because he approved them. His brothers sat on foreign thrones. His marshals governed entire regions. On maps, France no longer looked like a nation. It looked like the center of a system. To Napoleon, this was not domination. It was order. Yet one great power remained unconvinced. Russia. Tsar Alexander I had once been Napoleon's ally, bound by treaties and shared victories. But alliances built on fear and convenience do not last. The continental system strangled Russian trade. Nobles resented French influence. National pride burned quietly beneath diplomacy. Napoleon noticed the shift immediately. He saw Russian hesitation, not as caution, but as defiance. To him, defiance was contagious. If Russia resisted successfully, others would follow. His empire, built on momentum and obedience, could not afford hesitation. So he chose war. The decision was monumentally and fatal. In 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. Over 500,000 men from dozens of nations marched under French command. It was not just an army, it was a demonstration of dominance. Napoleon believed size alone would break Russian resistance before it truly began. He believed Russia would fight decisively. Russia did not. As Napoleon advanced eastward, the Russian army retreated. Villages were abandoned, fields were burned, supplies vanished. What Napoleon expected to be a swift campaign became a march into emptiness. Still, he pushed forward. Distance stretched, supply lines thin. Horses died. Men starved. Discipline eroded. Napoleon dismissed concerns. He had always won before decisive consequences could take hold. At Borodino, the Russians finally stood and fought. It was one of the bloodiest single-day battles in history. Cannon fire shook the earth. Smoke blinded entire divisions. Tens of thousands fell in hours. Napoleon won, but the victory felt hollow. The Russian army withdrew again, unbroken in spirit. Moscow lay ahead. When Napoleon entered the city, he expected surrender. Instead, he found silence. Moscow burned. Fires consumed entire districts. Supplies were destroyed. The city offered no refuge, no peace, no resolution. Napoleon waited for negotiations that never came. Days passed. Weeks passed. Winter crept closer. His army was dying. Finally, Napoleon ordered the retreat. What followed was catastrophe. Snow fell relentlessly. Temperatures plunged. Starvation and disease ravaged the army. Russian forces harassed the retreat without committing to full battle. Men collapsed and were left behind. Discipline disintegrated. The once great army dissolved into desperate survivors. Napoleon watched it happen powerless. By the time the remnants crossed back into Europe, fewer than a tenth of the original force remained. The myth of invincibility was shattered. Europe saw it instantly. Napoleon had overreached. The consequences were immediate. Allies defected. Enemies united. The belief that had sustained his empire began to crack under the weight of reality. For the first time, Napoleon was no longer ahead of history. He was being chased by it, and it was closing in fast. After the disaster in Russia, Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France, a changed man. He arrived in secret, leaving behind the frozen graves of his army. Publicly, he spoke of rebuilding. Privately, he knew the truth. The spell had been broken. Europe no longer feared what Napoleon might do. It had seen what he could not prevent. The response was immediate. Former allies turned away. Prussia rose in rebellion. Russia advanced westward, fueled not by speed, but by certainty. For the first time in years, Napoleon was no longer dictating the tempo of events. He tried to reclaim it. In 1813, Napoleon raised a new army young, inexperienced, hastily trained. Boys replaced the veterans. Confidence replaced preparation. He still possessed brilliance, but brilliance without resources was not enough. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced a coalition larger than any he had encountered before. 4 days, the fighting raged. Smoke covered the fields. Cannon fire thundered without pause. Napoleon maneuvered skillfully, striking where he could, but the numbers were overwhelming. When the battle ended, his army retreated. Germany was lost. The following year, coalition forces crossed into France itself. Napoleon fought a desperate defensive campaign, winning smaller battles through sheer genius. His movements were sharp, his instincts intact, but France was exhausted. The population wanted peace. The Senate turned against him. Even his marshals began to doubt. In April 1814, Napoleon abdicated. He was sent into exile on the island of Elba. For most rulers, exile meant disappearance. For Napoleon, it meant waiting. Elba was small, isolated, and humiliating. Yet Napoleon ruled it as if it were a kingdom. He reorganized administration, inspected troops, planned reforms. He followed events in France closely, and what he saw convinced him of one thing. The new government was weak. France missed him more than it admitted. In February 1815, Napoleon escaped. When he landed in southern France, he had no army-only reputation. Soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined him. Officers swore loyalty. Crowds gathered. Not a single shot was fired. By the time he reached Paris, Napoleon was emperor again. The 100 Days had begun. Europe reacted instantly. This time, there would be no negotiations, no compromises. Napoleon was declared an enemy of peace. Armies marched with one goal: end him permanently. Napoleon moved first. In June 1815, he confronted British and Prussian forces in Belgium. At Waterloo, the battle began well. Napoleon attacked aggressively, exploiting early advantages. But delays, miscommunication, and exhaustion took their toll. Then the Prussians arrived. The French lines collapsed. Napoleon fled the field not in panic, but in silence. He knew it was over. This time, there would be no return. Captured and exiled once more, Napoleon was sent far away to St. Helena, a barren island in the South Atlantic. There, stripped of power, surrounded by guards, he spent his final years dictating his version of history. He spoke of betrayal, of fate, of missed chances. But history was already writing its own conclusion. The man who had risen through speed, belief, and will had been undone by distance, resistance, and time. Napoleon died in 1821, far from the battlefields that defined him. Yet his shadow remained. Laws he created endured. Borders he, Red-Roo-shaped nations. Military doctrines he pioneered are still studied. He failed to conquer Europe. He changed it forever. History did not destroy Napoleon. It absorbed him. When Napoleon Bonaparte arrived on the island of St. Helena in 18, the world he had dominated no longer existed. St. Helena was not exile in name only, it was isolation by design. A volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of kilometers from Europe, surrounded by endless ocean. Escape was impossible. Visitors were rare. Letters were censored. Napoleon, once the center of Europe, was now reduced to a distant curiosity. For a man who had lived through constant motion, the stillness was unbearable. At first, Napoleon believed history would rescue him. He assumed that Europe would eventually fracture again, that France would regret his absence, that his name would be called once more. He kept his routines, rigid rising early, dictating thoughts, correcting maps from memory. He treated exile as temporary, but months passed, then years. Reality settled in slowly. Napoleon's health declined. The climate was damp and cold. His quarters were uncomfortable. He quarreled constantly with his British guards, especially the island's governor, whom he believed treated him deliberately without respect. Every slight felt symbolic. Every restriction felt personal. What Napoleon feared most was not captivity. It was irrelevant. So he turned to the only battlefield left to him: memory. He dictated his life to loyal companions, carefully shaping his legacy. Mistakes became necessities. Defeats became betrayals or fate. Victories were magnified, intentions purified. He portrayed himself as a man of progress, law, and reason done, not by ambition, but by Europeus refusal to change. He knew future generations would read these words, and he wanted to control what they saw. Yet even stripped of power, Napoleon could not escape contradiction. He spoke of liberty while ruling absolutely. He criticized kings while crowning himself emperor. He blamed others for disasters he had chosen to risk. History, unlike exile, offered no guards to argue with. Outside St. Helena, Europe rebuilt itself. Monarchies returned, but they could not erase what Napoleon had unleashed. Feudal systems were weakened. Legal equality spread. National identity grew stronger in places Napoleon had conquered and reorganized. Ironically, the man who sought control had helped create forces he could never command. In 1821, Napoleon died quietly. There were no armies, no cannon fire, no grand speeches. Only a small group of witnesses and a man who had once bent continents to his will. News of his death spread slowly, and then, inevitably myth replaced man. Napoleon became many things at once. Tyrant and hero, genius and warning, revolutionary and emperor. Every generation found a version of him that suited its needs. Military academies studied his campaigns. Politicians borrowed his image. Artists romanticized his fall, but the truth lies somewhere less dramatic. Napoleon was not destiny. He was possibility pushed to its limits. He rose because systems failed, because speed defeated tradition, because belief overcame fear. He fell because no individual, no matter how brilliant, can outrun geography, exhaustion, and time forever. In the end, Napoleon did not conquer Europe. Rebuild Italiano. And in doing so, he ensured that his name would never fully disappear no matter how far from the world he died. History did not forgive him. History remembered him.